In this lecture, we're going to focus on a number of unique elements that serves as the foundation for research as a whole. And we begin with this concept called the research paradigm. And by definition, a paradigm refers to a philosophical, a theoretical framework of a scientific school or discipline that addresses theories, laws, and generalizations. And from those, the paradigm approach will generate conclusions for research that is conducted. And so the paradigm reflects beliefs about knowledge and about generalizations. And so we can think about a paradigm as a way of thinking that reflects the attitudes of the researchers, and that will dictate the approach that a set of researchers will often take with respect to the research studies, the experiments that are conducted. And to illustrate the concept of a paradigm, not necessarily a research paradigm, but just a paradigm generally, we're going to examine the issue of abortion. Now, by examining abortion through a particular paradigm, there are two that I will focus on here. The first paradigm is one that is focused on individual rights. And when we talk about individual rights, we're talking about a single person. So by taking this approach, this paradigm for viewing and interpreting abortion, the individual rights approach views abortion as a medical procedure. And as it is a medical procedure, it's viewed as a health issue. And this health issue views abortion by the procedural definition, the medical definition, as terminating a pregnancy. The other paradigm in viewing abortion focuses on what's called collective rights. And collective rights is one where each individual has a voice, but the overall summary of all those voices will be the deciding factor in how a society moves forward with policy related to abortion. So by taking the collective rights paradigm approach, abortion is viewed as a life-ending procedure. And in that light, some refer to abortion as murder, since it is an intentional medical based procedure. And as such, the collective rights paradigm views abortion as an issue for society as a whole to decide, and taken out of the decision of each individual member of that society. Now, there was a paradigm shift in the United States. And so the picture here you see in the middle of the computer screen are the front steps of the Supreme Court of the United States. And very recently, specifically on June 24th, 2022, the case of Dobbs versus the Jackson Women's Health Organization made it on the docket and was argued in front of the Supreme Court, who then made a decision that ended the right to abortion nationwide. And in making that paradigm shift, a number of issues were considered. And so this paradigm shift operated under a wide range of assumptions. Those assumptions were formulated by personal beliefs of the individuals making the decision on the Supreme Court, and the personal beliefs brought by the attorneys that argued the case on both sides. Certainly politics and legal interpretations were all factored into that major paradigm shift in the United States. So as we move on here with the research paradigm, we now take a view of how the attitudes, how the viewpoints of researchers will shape the process of that research. And there are three main elements that we'll talk about with respect to the research paradigm. The first is epistemology, and this is actually a branch of philosophy that is concerned with the nature and definition of knowledge and the truth. And this will define the type of information that we often refer to as data in research. And so the term data is used all the time, but what data is really a reflection of is the fact that research is gathering information. And epistemology defines that information that's gathered should be valid, which speaks to the truthfulness of that information, as well as it being useful, as well as truth. So, and you can add truthfulness as a definition of that validity. And there are three elements of epistemology that we'll address. The first is positivism, interpretivism is the second one, and then we'll touch on critical realism. The second major element of the research paradigm is ontology. And this is another branch of philosophy that's concerned with the nature of reality and how reality is often interpreted. And we'll certainly come back to that. In the third branch of the research paradigm, and it's a branch that we'll spend the majority of this course addressing, and that's methodology. When we think about methodology, we think about the methods that will drive research, and that focuses on how information or data is collected. And once that information or data is collected, how do we make sense of that data? Which is to say, how do we analyze that data? That information has to be analyzed so we can draw usefulness out of it. And there are a number of different ways in which this can be carried out in research. The first is taking a quantitative approach. And the quantitative approach is one where we apply numerical values to our observations or the information that we're collecting. The opposite to the quantitative is the qualitative approach, where we do not put numerical values to our observations. Not all observations can be accurately described with a number, and that's where qualitative types of research studies are highly valuable. And many research studies will take what's called a mixed methods approach, which will use a range of both quantitative and qualitative modes of collecting information. We begin with the research paradigm concepts here with epistemology. And as previously defined, epistemology is a branch of philosophy, and Auguste Comte was a political philosopher and is considered the founder of positivism. And positivism is simply establishing knowledge and truth to be valid as gathered through something called the scientific method. And the scientific method is based on direct observation and measurement by researchers. So we take a very systematic, a very intentional approach to gathering up information. And once we've gathered that information in a very valid sort of way, we can then generate what are called generalizations, which are conclusions based upon that information we collect, that we can move forward and make recommendations that will affect health practices and health policies. This all occurs by establishing what are called variables. And once we establish variables that we collect and observe, we can therefore examine relationships between those variables, especially those types of relationships that establish what's called cause and effect. And we'll discuss that in much greater detail a little bit later on. When we talk about the scientific method, Sir Francis Bacon, who predated Auguste Comte uh, uh, for a number of a couple of centuries, uh, was a philosopher and is actually considered the founder of the scientific method. And Sir Francis Bacon established the process of science, what's considered today as scientific inquiry, in his 1620 publication. And he established a process called induction. By making direct observations of certain behaviors of individuals, we can therefore generate conclusions that can span all individual behavior. And that's something that we'll certainly address as well. Interpretivism is actually it sits in contrast to positivism. So when you think about positivism, think about something that's very objective, observed, and those observations are interpreted as they are observed. Interpretivism refers to interpreting um, observations in a more subjective manner, and by doing that, it will bring a greater understanding of various social issues. Uh, and so this attempts to develop an understanding of what the world looks like through the eyes of not those doing the studying, but those that are being studied. And so this approach in research puts inherent value on the insight of research participants. And the foundation of this is empathy, not sympathy, but empathy, in making an attempt to not view research participants just as a medium to collect information that can be analyzed statistically, but actually valuing each research participant for their individual perspective on what is being studied. The third element of epistemology is what's called critical realism. And this establishes that by theorizing, developing theories in a very well thought manner, is the foundation for establishing knowledge and truth rather than just simply measuring or observing. And in this approach, reality exists independently of the individual's perceptions, because our perception of the outside world is often shaped by our experience with that outside world and our memories of that outside world that reflects our attitudes. And so perceptions can often not align perfectly with the objective reality of that outside world. And this establishes what's called generative mechanisms as a theoretical analysis of human behavior. The second element of the research paradigm is what's called ontology. And ontology asks the question, do we study things that are considered objective entities or social constructions? And so ontology establishes two contrasting approaches here. The first is objectivism, the second is constructionism. So with objectivism, researchers will study a phenomenon, human behaviors, that exist as external objects. And so in this sense, the researcher is not influencing the information that is being collected from human research participants, but is just simply acting as an external observer. So if we wish to examine height and weight of individual research participants that come from a particular population, the attitudes, the impressions, the reflections of the researcher will have zero effect on the measurement of height and weight. And so objectivism has connections to positivism and critical realism. Constructionism is going to be focused on socially constructed objects. And this is where the researchers' beliefs, ideologies, the behaviors, and human action will influence how that information is interpreted. And so this will study various identities and treats the individual more holistically rather than just some sort of inanimate object from which we collect information through observation. And so constructionism has connections to interpretivism in where the reality of some observation is interpreted with varying contexts. The third element of the research paradigm is just simply referred to as methodology. And that's where we'll focus on this course for the most part. And when we think about methodology, it points to a focus on how information or data is collected. And so in this case, data is not collected because it's available and that we can. There is a unique purpose for research reasons for gathering that kind of information. So what kind of data is to be collected? How is that information going to be collected? And once that information or data is collected, how will that information be used? And so that, as introduced a little bit earlier, there are two general approaches here. The first is what we just referred to as a quantitative approach. And taking a quantitative approach means that we will place numerical values, numbers basically, to those observations or the outcomes, and we do so under standardized conditions. This approach will apply statistical procedures, pre-established mathematical equations that will operate under certain types of research approaches. And there are two general attempts here. This approach will attempt to establish a relationship between two or more variables or causation. When we talk about causation, we would say that exposure to a particular risk factor will cause the development of a particular disease. That is research designed to make that sort of statement. A relationship examines a correlation between two or more variables that does not establish causation, but is no less useful as causation types of research studies. So the quantitative approach is closely aligned with a positivist or a positivistic approach, and taking that objective approach as well. A qualitative means of gathering information methodologically is done through what are called open-ended questionnaires. A questionnaire that we would ask a research participant to complete, if it's open-ended, does not have a pre-selected and exhaustive number of answers that the research participant can select. It's basically allowing the research participant to use whatever means, whatever words, whatever descriptions they wish to answering certain questions. Surveys are often structured so that the research participant has a limited set of responses to each question, and interviews and observations are also used in a qualitative manner. So the qualitative approach attempts to provide that holistic type of examination of research participants, and as such does not apply numerical descriptions. And this attempts to describe human behavior in different settings that numerical values just would not be able to adequately describe. And so the qualitative approach is closer aligned to the interpretivist philosophy and constructionism as well. So one example here are evaluating educational methods, where numerical values provides very limited useful information for practitioners. But by directly observing how students in a class behave and how those students respond to different educational approaches can be described a little bit more accurately and with more usefulness, oftentimes with a qualitative methodology. So this ends part 3 of our Unit 1 lecture.